Okay, I'm starting a new course. I'm going to just call it Drawdown Climate Solutions, which is directly based on a book called Drawdown, edited by Paul Hawken, which is a very comprehensive list of climate solutions that are ranked the top 100. And I'm going to motivate the course also by including the book by Bill Gates and take appropriate points from his book. And there are other books like How to Develop Climate Solutions, The 100% Solution. There are many, but the idea would be to really focus the course on specifics. And I will start that by pointing out some issues that are kind of key to consider why we need to rush to directly start to develop solutions, implement solutions, train students to think about solutions, because we have now had so much climate solutions, so many IPCC reports, so much talk about how short a time we have to save the world and so on, and yet the emissions keep going up. So I'll take some figures from a few reports from the World Energy Forum, the emissions gap report from the UN, and so on, to make a few points that I hope set up the reason why we want to just focus on solutions. This is a map from this website, newclimate.org, which lists all the dots which are about countries which are promising to start thinking about net zero, which is to basically go to zero carbon by 2050. Doesn't mean there will be no emissions. It'll be about taking out as much or more carbon from the atmosphere than we put in. Of course, there are details, whether technologies exist and so on, but the goal is out there and it's a good one. So it's not so much about efficiencies, reducing emissions and so on, but to directly head for net zero. We will come back later on and to see whether negative emissions, net zero, decarbonization and all these terms make better sense, or something like drawdown makes a better sense. The book Drawdown makes a case that that's the best way to say it, but of course language can be a problem on how the problem gets framed and perceived, most importantly perceived by people, by politicians, by banks, by decision makers and so on. Okay, so these are all the cities and states and countries that have started thinking about net zero by 2050. So there are some caveats here. We include any actors that aim to reduce their emissions by at least 80%, as well as those that explicitly state that they have made or intend to make net zero commitment. Okay, so obviously Europe and North America are lighting up here, as well as some parts of South America, Japan, China, India are involved, Australia and so on. And you can see the uniqueness of a country like America having lots of issues with Paris Agreement, pulling it out of the commitment, and then Biden and Harris trying to bring it back, but the states and cities going ahead anyways, and country like India, which has a large percent of the population as shown by these colors. You can see that even there are cities which are committing. So this would be good news, and even better news is that some trends in the progress, governments and corporations. So comparing 2016 to 2019, countries with a carbon neutral ambition has jumped quite a bit, 10 times. Countries with a robust climate policy has gone up. Corporate emissions disclosed to CDP is 24% to 36%. This is companies with a science-based target, 27 to 296. Okay, obviously great news, and you have to put that in the context of the global warming targets we are setting. I have this habit of going tick, which may be annoying. Sorry about that. I'll try to avoid it. No sound. Global net emissions pathways required to meet targets like 1.5 degrees centigrade, which are 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees, are not necessarily robust scientific targets. They started out as assumptions by economists like Bill Nordhaus, got taken up by the Stern Report and then EU and so on. Nonetheless, they are there, and they give a way to look for what level of carbon drawdown is needed, the rate of carbon drawdown needed, and so on. So we are on these trajectories here, and Paris pledges bring us down, but not anywhere close to the 1.5 degree compatible pathways. So this is the carbon emission pathways that would be needed if we wanted to head to 1.5 degrees by 2100 with a certain probability, like let's say 66%. So this is where the solutions would come in. Already by these measures we are behind. By 2021, when I'm recording this, we are not anywhere on this target, and if we look at the emissions, we will feel the same. So this is about the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions under Paris Agreement, which made the process much more democratic as opposed to the Kyoto Protocol, which was much more top-down. Each country has submitted some plan back in 2015, submitted a plan before 2020, and already it's clear that those plans are not going to get us much closer to the too close to the target. It's still far away. So there are obviously needs to update the NDCs, and this is just showing countries that have stated their intention to update NDCs by 2020, which were already passed. COVID took over humanity, and now we have other issues to deal with, which is a good example of how difficult climate change action is always going to be, unless solutions begin to emerge that are very easily adopted and are very easily sold to people and politicians. 79 is the countries that have stated their intention to enhance ambition or action in an NDC by 2020, and 2 are the countries here in South America. I think it's maybe Suriname and French Guyana or Guyana, one of those small countries, that have submitted a 2020 NDC representing a 0% global emissions. Other words, all the countries are on the table discussing emissions reductions, etc. But the reality is, after more than 2 decades of negotiations, as of 2019 and into 2020, we are still on a path of increasing global greenhouse gas emissions here in gigaton CO2 equivalent, which includes methane, N2O, land use change contributions, and so on. And they are split here as fossil fuel CO2, which is of course the monstrous contribution. There are methane, N2O, fluorinated gases, and contributions of CO2 and methane and N2O from land use change. Okay. 2020 did bring some reductions because of COVID lockdowns, reductions in industrial activities, travels, and so on. Here are the various sectors, and these are negative numbers, so below 2019 compared to the numbers we are looking at here. But you can see that already by summer of 2020 there were increases back in industrial activities, residential combustions. Aviation and shipping are still down, but they are going to pick up very soon again. So by 2021 we are showing signs of going back to business as usual in terms of emissions levels. Not to blame any country, but obviously countries like China and India are growing fast. Their ambition is to grow, and they should have an ambition of bringing their poor people into a decent standards of living. The question is, how do we do it without increasing carbon? There are countries like EU and UK which show a decrease in per capita emissions as well as greenhouse gas emissions, and there are details involved there which we will not go into. And of course, the per capita emissions of China and India are still low compared to the countries like US and Russia here. Of course, Russia is an outlier in terms of where it's headed economically and politically. But it is good news that certain countries are reducing per capita emissions, but all the economic stimulus and so on, which are supposed to control for climate action, are still out there and have to be monitored for the next few years. And I will show another chart about the impact of COVID next. So this is just showing the same idea of temperature targets and where we are in terms of 2010 policy scenarios and current policy scenarios by 2020, I think, and where they will put us in 2030, and the emissions gaps in terms of what is pledged under NDCs, what is needed for the various temperature targets, and the emissions gaps we end up with in terms of gigaton CO2 equivalent. Okay, so that is 2050, and that is zoomed down to 2030, which is a much more realistic decision horizon. Again, it's just a motivation for the course, saying that the richest people still continue to consume huge amounts. So this is average per capita emissions in 2015 by the top 1% income, top 10% income earners, and so on, and the percentage of population they represent. So this emphasizes the point that unless you lift the bottom 50% income earners, who don't emit much but often pay a very high price for the climate impacts in terms of floods, drought, extreme events, heat, energy, food, water, health, and so on. So solutions also have to move these people up in terms of the vulnerability reductions against climate change impacts and resilience against climate change. So we will look at what those solutions are. I'm not going into the details of these because I'm just trying to set up the concept of where we want to go. This just again shows where we would have been in 2030 before the COVID hit, based on the scenarios done then. And these are scenarios, post-COVID scenarios, looking at how much reduction COVID brought if there was only one wave, or if we got second major wave. Already we are having all kinds of issues. It needs to be seen how vaccines will control the situation in the coming years. But nonetheless, we expect that in 2030, compared to the pre-COVID scenarios, the post-COVID recovery will help if done properly, especially if done properly in terms of bringing down the emissions by 2030. And these are the different policy scenarios on how the post-COVID economic recovery plans are done in terms of energy and industry CO2, land use CO2, and non-CO2 greenhouse gases. In other words, the rush to bring the economy back to full force after COVID impacts has to keep in mind that the recovery has to focus also on emissions, heading towards carbon neutrality, and so on and so forth. So these are just numbers of scenarios and the CO2 emission gap we would end up, and obviously 2010 policies would create a huge gap. Current policies are not that much more lower. Unconditional and conditional NDCs are where countries that committed to the nationally determined contributions would carry out the actions anyways, which would be less ambitious. But conditional NDCs are where the countries actually get financial and other assistance to implement their NDCs. countries like India which are looking for help, for example. That would be better, so it would lower the emissions gap by 2030 a little bit more. But if we want to head to below 2 degrees C and below 1.8 and 1.5 with 66% probability, we need to reduce those emissions gaps by much more. Okay, that's the main message, that everything points to us not being on track in reality in terms of the emissions we are creating despite all the negotiations, NDCs, pledges, policies, and so on. And the course I will try to focus on ideas based on these books about what are the solutions and look at what are the investments involved, what are the net profits that actually may come out in terms of the reduced emissions and other ways of accounting for net benefits, let's say, not profits, of the investments in those solutions. And I'm going to post this on Facebook and ask for collaborations, people who want to be part of the course and want to contribute. Then we can coordinate the lectures accordingly and make it much more of a collective effort than me presenting the ideas from the books, adding my own flavor to it. So, look forward to the next podcasts.